European integration is founded on 4 freedoms: the freedom of movement of people, money, goods and services. Of all those, a single market in cross-border services has been the most elusive, at least until recently. But in this Parliament, the EPP-ED Group has made the liberalisation of services a top priority. The result of its commitment is the Services Directive, a landmark piece of legislation that breaks down national barriers and combats protectionism. The EPP-ED Group has long advocated a single market that delivers enhanced economic growth, more consumer choice, innovation and enterprise. Central to this philosophy is the right of service providers to be able to operate across national borders with a minimum of bureaucracy. To begin with, there was considerable opposition to the Commission's proposal from some other political groups in the Parliament. Fears about social dumping were expressed, perhaps most famously by alluding to the so-called Polish plumber, an invention which reflected concerns about service providers from newer member states undercutting wages and employment standards in older member states. The group's shadow rapporteur on the services dossier was British MEP Malcolm Harbour. Why does Europe need this legislation?
Well, services are 70% of the European economy. The treaty says that we should have cross-border movement of services. But what's happened is that there have been a huge number of obstructive pieces of legislation in member states that have discriminated against service providers. And so what we needed was a significant, to use the jargon, horizontal piece of legislation, but something that will cover all services, which would require member states to remove that discriminatory legislation, and also to encourage service providers to operate cross-border through giving them information points and sources, and to essentially to enshrine the treaty rights that service providers have within a legislative framework.
What role did the EPP-ED Group play in guiding this legislation through the Parliament?
Well, I think guiding is perhaps too gentle a word. I mean, frankly, if it wasn't for the EPP-ED Group, we'd have had a services directive that was completely ineffective. The original socialist proposal was just to water this down completely. The EPP-ED Group was actually the crucial political force in getting on the statute books an effective services legislation that was agreed by Council. And initially there was a lot of opposition by some member states as well. So we had to work politically at all levels. We had to use our contacts in member states and member state governments.
So how difficult was it to forge a compromise between the main political groups in the Parliament?
Well, it was extremely difficult. But clearly we had to make some concessions, but first of all about the scope of it. I think that the exclusion, for example, of health was the right thing to do because we wanted that treated by a separate directive, which is now in the Parliament, and our colleague John Bowis is handling that at the moment. We fought very strongly to ensure that public services that were delivered through private enterprise were included in so-called services of general economic interest. The socialists were desperate to take that out. We had to make a number of other concessions, but the most important things were that we kept the fundamental principles, which is that member states had to screen all their national legislation and remove or justify any discriminatory aspects.
For businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, the passage of the Services Directive through the Parliament offered major opportunities to create jobs and growth. It was therefore essential for business organisations to ensure that their concerns were heard, and they found a natural ally in the EPP-ED Group, according to Patrice Pellegrino from Eurocommerce, a leading industry association. What can you say about the cooperation between the EPP-ED Group and industry organisations such as yours that represent businesses?
If we are just focusing on the business, then we could say that the EPP Group just tried to get the views of the businesses, but which is not true. They tried to get the view of all the players, trade unions, NGOs of any kind, just to understand. Because how do you want to go through a process of such a complicated text if you do not understand all the aspects?
So how confident are you about the implementation of this directive?
Then I'm quite confident for the time being, because I have to say that now the Commission was not very present at the moment of the discussions, is really active. in following the implementation directive. I think that now there is a common understanding in the Commission that this is one of the major pieces of legislation which has been achieved under this term.
The opening up of the services sector in the European Union comes at a critical stage in Europe's economic development. The directive has the potential to create hundreds of thousands of jobs and to stimulate much needed growth throughout Europe in the midst of the economic crisis.